Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of the War Report. Of course, I am your gracious host, Constantine Martelli. You can look down at the channel name down there. That is yours truly. And we have GSP over here, all the way from his bunker in Macedonia, as always. Although, if you were to listen to the difference between us, one would assume with the internet connection I have, I'm the one who lives in the bunker. And speaking of that, I've seen your comments, and I've played with my audio settings a bit, so it's just going to be a bit of trial and error. Just let me know if you like these ones better, or whether I should go back to the old ones, or if somebody knows stuff about OBS and wants to get into contact with me, of course you can do that. But I think the issue should be resolved. But we have a hell of an episode ahead of us, as we were just talking about right before we started recording. So, of course, there was the FBI raid on Mar-a-Lago when it came to Trump and all the crap that's involved with that. That was at the beginning of the week. And while the mainstream, while most people, even most people who are politically inclined, will focus on that, insofar as this show is concerned, and I'm sure you all know that since you're here watching this, that has become the minor story this week. We have, and I want to just do some of the clickbait stuff here. We have bombshells of stories tonight, particularly out of Syria and Ukraine. So, starting with Syria, I have to say, I'm not going to come out yet and say I have been fully vindicated, but I am on the cusp of an vindication when it comes to it being the last summer at Idlib. Because there were some interesting diplomatic developments this week when it came to Turkey, in particular, when it came to their role in the war in Syria. So, of course, there's been ongoing tentative negotiations for several years at this point that really took off in 2018. I guess we could call the negotiations to build a post-war Syria really began in 2018. You recall all those conferences in Turkey with, of course, Erdogan being there, but also having Putin, Rouhani. You had those conferences, and then you'd have the ones where Erdogan would host Macron, Merkel, and Putin as well. And those fell apart for a while. Syria did take a backseat, especially around the time of the entire COVID crisis, because focuses were shift so much. And then after that, we get hit with the Ukraine crisis. But in the background, Syria has been going on, and I'll just give you a brief map of what we have here in Syria as usual. And you can actually see on the map with some of the icons indicated, the green ones with the silhouettes of people in northwestern Syria are protests going on right now after Erdogan had more or less cut off the Syrian rebels after his meeting with Putin and his phone meeting with Assad. And he said that Syrian territorial integrity must be respected. And this, of course, comes in light of increased tensions with the SDF forces. And the SDF forces, of course, being the American aligned Kurdish forces, and even they have been cut off by the Americans now after tensions rose with Turkey. They cut them loose for a second time. And because the media cycle changes from time to time depending on who's in power, who's calling what shots, you'll recall when something a fraction of this happened, it was Trump betrayed the Kurds, Trump let our allies down. Of course, they won't say that about Biden. I'm not even condemning Biden for that. I could not care less about the fantasies of Kurdish statehood. But point being is, this has been completely swept under the rug. Syria has become a complete afterthought ever since the 2018 strikes, I'll say outright. And you saw it was actually after the 2018 strikes, the talks I mentioned just a few minutes ago started to take place in late 2018 after the second wave of U.S. strikes after the alleged chemical attacks. Now, with what we have here, Erdogan is not the most consistent or reliable head of state, most consistent or reliable statesman for that matter. However, although he could do a 180, although he could go back to Ankara and tell his people, we're going to do X, Y, and Z in Syria now, which isn't out of his leadership style or his personality, But if you look at the reactions of the Syrian opposition groups, the massive protests they're having, it would imply that some sort of on the ground action has been taken between whatever Turkish handlers are embedded in these groups or affiliated with these groups and these groups themselves. It wouldn't, in my opinion, it would imply that some sort of tangible action has already happened to show these opposition groups that they're no longer on Turkey's dole. However, I could be wrong about that. Maybe this is just some grand plan. Maybe everyone put them up to it, but I severely doubt that. But just to mention the vague possibility of it. And you have that. You have the Kurds cut off. And if you look at Erdogan's statement, it does have multiple meanings because you can look at from the point of view where he wants out of Syria, he's going to throw in the towel, and we must respect Syria's territorial integrity means we must take care of these opposition groups we've been supporting for the better, for just over a decade. But that also applies to the so-called Syrian Democratic Forces, who, as you see, occupy more or less everything north of the Euphrates. And of course, as U.S. Turkish relations turn to tensions, you have that perpetual fear that the U.S. will take more steps, if not outright support Kurdish statehood. Now, I think that is a mass red line that they would only employ in a situation where relations with Turkey were irreconcilable, which they're pretty bad right now, but in a post Erdogan Turkey, there's still opportunity that it could fall back in line. But with the way we're looking at it, we have Erdogan cutting off the Syrian opposition and also saying that the SDF is illegitimate, which he's been saying for a matter of years. But he's also coming to what is an agreement with the current Syrian government on the matter of the SDF. And then that's all on top of the American empire cutting them off. So these are the most pivotal moves we've seen in Syria, I would say, in 4 years. I would say since that U.S. strike. Now, I'm not going to say that U.S. strike really changed the course of Syria, but 2018 was the last time Syria was really this dynamic, and it looks like we are entering, finally, the end stages of the war. I don't want to speak too soon, but after having followed this war for many years and for about 4 years doing this show, given the trends I have observed, in my personal opinion, we're witnessing the final stages, both militarily and diplomatically, of this Syrian crisis.
I mean, the main thing from this story that I'm curious about is what is America's position in all this? Um, in a way, by deduction, we kind of know because, as you mentioned, now there is kind of growing strife between the SDF and the US. So much so that the SDF leadership has refused to continue any communication with Washington uh, over what they see as a weak Washington that is not able to protect them from Turkey. In the past, this has forced them to cooperate more closely with Assad, which is not what they want to do, because ultimately what they want to do is tear a piece of Syria away for themselves. I always find, the Kurds hilarious. I find a lot of countries that, slavishly side with the Americans hilarious because it's like they all have a get rich quick scheme. Here's how to get your own country, right? Um, and there's no irony for them that America might not want you to become like your own country, or you'll get betrayed later. And the Kurds, really, this is the second time that they've been betrayed. And then I'm not talking, of course, about Trump in 2019. I'm talking about late 80s, early 90s with the first Gulf War and so on, when Saddam Hussein dealt with them and the Americans abandoned them. The question is, where are they going to go, right? This also comes down to what are Kurdish aspirations going to be now, right? Like, uh, Israel is not going to swoop in to help them. Uh, yes, Israel probably gets a good deal of oil once it's transported and stolen from Syria, brought into Iraq, and from there can go into Israel, which is what happened since the second Iraqi war. But what's going to happen to them now? Like, if they're not willing to communicate with Washington, I mean, there isn't anyone that's going to, save the Kurds. So it's a big deal, and in many ways, the Kurds are saying it's a hopeless situation. They're so angry that they refuse to even speak to the Americans. After how long has it been? It's been almost 9 years of American presence, 8 years of American presence in Syria, and in many ways, the Kurds are not any closer to getting a state in Syria. And it could be something that the Americans don't want to get involved with. And primarily because Erdogan is essentially, what I've often described as the most complex war in modern history. Erdogan has refused to cooperate with America in Syria. It doesn't really totally cooperate with anybody. Erdogan always finds a way to get what he wants. But remember, the Kurds are very upset because this past week they lost several of their fighters again from Turkish attacks. Something like in excess of 100 drones were fired at them. I've mentioned on the show that Turks are getting killed there, and these are regular forces. These are not just jihadis hired by Turkey. And this is in the northeastern corner of Syria. So what are they going to do? Where are they going to go? I think they're obviously profoundly disappointed, but if they cut off communication with Washington, I have to conclude that they're going to have to work with Assad to get some kind of a deal, and with the Russians. It's not what they want, but it could be all that they're going to get. And as you hinted earlier, like this, along with the protests that are happening in Idlib, they've been going on for over 24 hours now. Um, some of the protesters have been shot because the Turks are using live ammo. Uh, it seems to indicate that they know something is afoot. Some kind of an agreement has been reached. As you say, they probably know better than we do. And that is why they're doing this, because the Kurds have no one else that they're going to be able to turn to, right? The Kurds in Iraq without America cannot do anything for them. So, the get a country quick scheme is not going to work for the Kurds. Sad as that may be to Kurds, but that is how the real world works.
And of course, this will also serve as a delegitimization to any other ethnic breakoff group in any other country that the U.S. may be involved in.
Yeah.
To take a topical example, perhaps the Uyghurs in China, insofar as they actually have a serious independence movement, which I don't believe. If America can't even accomplish that in a country like Syria, what makes a group in a major power think that? Or any myriad of examples, of course, as all the world powers become further invested in Africa, that is just a patchwork of different tribes, ethnicities, etc., where it comes down to the question of can said power deliver what it promises? And we also can couple that with the current situation in Ukraine. Sure, we're pouring billions upon billions of dollars, but to what result? If we
Hmm.
were providing this aid and the Ukrainians actually performed as we were led to believe at the beginning of the war, that would be different. But we just throw money on this trash fire, and the results tend to become worse and worse, as a matter of fact. And as you'll get into the minutia minute, as I said, we have some major news out of Ukraine in the just over the past week, and the situation in Taiwan has also not been quelled. It's less tense than it was when we talked about last week, but it is still ongoing. And if that leads to another similar situation where it's another unkept promise, where it's another empty
Mhm.
threat or whatever, the legitimacy of a country that's already slipping in legitimacy is going to go down further. Now, of course, there's always boisterous statements, there's always bluff, there's always these gamuts that are taken. For example, one of the ones I saw that kept circulating during the China Taiwan crisis was the phrase China's final warning, which was a joke within Soviet diplomatic circles during the Sino Soviet split, that although they always threaten this, they never follow through. So these kind of things aren't new, but I do think there's a difference between boisterous threats and bravado and talking a big game and then
Mhm.
failing to deliver actual material results, as we've seen in Syria, as we've seen in Ukraine, as we've seen in Iraq, as we've seen in, I could name about a dozen different countries at this point, but we would be all here all day now, wouldn't we? But there also is other major news out of the Middle East, particularly relating to the issue of Israel, the current Palestinian conflict, and the ongoing Abraham Accords, which Trump himself was so proud of.
Yeah. If
So,
I could just say one thing
yeah,
before
go ahead.
you
Go ahead.
go on with Israel. I'm sorry, this slipped my mind. The row between America and Russia, actually, sorry, America and the Kurds in Syria, has escalated to the point where the Kurds now don't even they will not even assist the Americans fighting against ISIS in that pocket, which um, reputationally it hurts the Americans. But I mean, no American or Western press is covering really what's going on there. In fact, again, this hurts the Kurds more than it does the Americans, right? But that indicates just how angry they are. So that's all I have to say.
Oh, yes, and people often associate the Kurds with Syria because that's been their main field of operation at this point, but you have to remember there's been just shy of 20, in fact, over 20 years of cooperation with them in Iraq and various unfulfilled promises out of just the Iraq war itself. Now, the Kurds, in my opinion, got a pretty good deal from the reconstruction of Iraq, but there's a lot of things that once the U.S. does finally leave, many people in Iraq,
Mm,
whether they be of a Sunni, Shia, or whatever ethnic or religious background they may be, are going to have very strong grudges towards the Kurds and view them as collaborators with a foreign power. You see these kind of things happen all the time, even in more homogenous societies where groups, whether that be a religious or an ideological group or an ethnic group, who collaborated with the invading power, are treated very harshly and are given severe punishment for their cooperation. You saw, not to the extent that they fearmongered about, you saw that to an
hmm.
extent in Afghanistan, which I do want to talk a little bit about Afghanistan later, seeing as we're on the coming up on the year anniversary of the U.S. withdrawal. I do think that is worth revisiting in short, but I will get to that in a little bit here. But you can only imagine from the Kurdish perspective whether that is one of these Iraqi groups like the Peshmerga, whether it's the YPG or SDF. There's not so much association with the PKK, or the PKK proper, simply because of the delicate balance that we try to strike with Turkey. And the Iranian Kurds are, unlike their co-ethnics outside of Iran, not as keen on independence. It's not to say that the independent streak doesn't exist within them, but compared to, for example, Iraq or Syria, it doesn't exist to the same extent.
Hmm.
It's uh, much more cohesive there, whether that is through government force or just the development of the culture. I mean, because the Kurds are an Iranian people. Not, I mean, they're not. proper Iranians. They're not Persian, but they do come from that broader tapestry of ethnicities that comes out of the Iranian plateau. And their language is similar to Persian. It's not a Semitic
They have
language.
some
It's not
Turkish
Arabic.
loan words and stuff, but
Um,
they're
yes.
yeah.
But that's fundamentally where they have their origins, and of course, I suppose all of the languages in that region have Turkish loanwords just because of the absolute domination that was put upon the region for a number of centuries by the Ottoman Empire and other various Turkish empires that rose and fell during those times.
I wonder if they say stuff like "we was Medes" and shit.
I mean, probably.
No, I don't want to. I've
It's
gone too far.
no, it's absurd. You delve into some of these very minor and obscure ethnic conflicts. Lebanon's probably one of my personal favorite ones, where there is just that faction of people convinced that they are the pure-blooded Phoenicians, that they are direct descendants of the
Yeah.
Phoenicians themselves. And you find this everywhere, where it's just, I mean, it is a bit of a statelet thing. You kind of see this in Ukrainians when it comes to like the whole like we was Rus thing, where these very small groups today, for understandable reasons, even just for the sake of developing identity, need some narrative to connect themselves to, some great ancestry, some great feat that they can claim for their entire people, which virtually every ethnicity does that in some capacity. But when you're a Kurd without a without a state that even represents your ethnicity, or any kind of group like that, it just becomes laughable. But I'm getting off on a bit of a tangent here. So, getting into some of the Middle Eastern news, there, of course, has been an upswell in the tensions between the Israelis and the Palestinians over, of course, the issues that have been going on since 1947. If you just want me to be completely
Yes.
frank about it, but there has been an upswell in uh, the stabbing attacks in the what would probably be considered terrorism, and of course the strikes on Gaza itself. As we said, there was the mobilization of reserves on both sides, and as this all happens, you also have an upcoming election in Israel in November, and you also have the very fragile situation of the Arab Gulf states that are trying to build bridges with Israel, as was spearheaded by Trump with the Abraham Accords. But six Arab nations, have pulled out of the most recent summit, citing concerns over the uh, future of Israel because they are going to election yet again, and saying that we can't have confidence that this is going to be a reliable agreement when there's the potential to change government in such a short amount of time. So you have them pulling out of that. That's on top of the Gulf states also back and forth they've been having with the U.S. about oil production, and even some of the overtures that they've tried to have with the Iranians as well. The Gulf states, I'm not trying to downplay their influence or anything, but they are a shell of what they were even just 20 years ago in terms of diplomatic influence. Sure, they produce a lot of energy. Sure, they produce the oil, the natural gas, all that good stuff, all that stuff that keeps the lights on. Unfortunately for our German friends, I think that may be an antiquated statement, but I'll get into some of the news about Europe once again later in the show. And you look at just the past 20 years, the amount of influence they've had has seen a marked decrease. And you could say the Abraham Accords. I could do an entire show just on those, just on the Trump Kushner plan in order to bring peace to the Middle East, all that hodgepodge, all that crap. But yeah, I don't want to get too far off on that tangent, but you have them pulling out. You have more or less Israel becoming more and more isolated, whether that be from its neighbors, not that its neighbors have ever particularly liked it. As I said, it takes one internal political shift in Egypt for the situation to go from the tentative peace of the past 45, 50 years to a much more hostile situation. And that will depend
Hmm.
on you can tell while Israel is willing to shove around other countries, one country they always tiptoe around is Egypt because the balance of power is so delicate there. At least that's what I've noticed, and not to say that they don't do it at all, but they've always had a very careful approach to Egypt ever since the normalization in 1979. And you have that, you have the waning American empire, you have the absolute cratering of relations with Russia on Israel's part, and you have growing sentiments among various Western political groups and even Western governments who are skeptical of the Zionist project, at least in its current form. So, and sure, you can cite the economic relations and the growth in economic relations with China, but I doubt China is going to use its influence in the world to do favors for Israel. It's just business is business as far as their relationship is concerned. So you have this country that is slowly diplomatically isolating itself on top of severe internal problems that have to do with heavily disputed territory. And I
Hmm.
know you were mentioning some of the dynamic between Iran, Israel, and Russia, and I saw some of that earlier this week. If you want to go into more detail about that as well.
Oh, about Iran.
Yes.
Yes. So Tuesday of this past week, uh, as everybody realizes, Iran and Russia are working much more closely than ever. There's this back and forth about, Iran working with Russia and developing and training the use of drones. This is something that Russia hasn't really fully exploited in the way that the Ukrainians and the Turks have. Uh, Russia does have the Lancelet drone. It does have suicide drones, but they tend to use observational reconnaissance drones mostly for guiding their artillery and their MLRS systems. But on Tuesday, there was the launch of it was using a Soyuz rocket in Baikonur, Kazakhstan, and I think the name of the satellite is the Kayana. No, the Kayam satellite. So Israel has expressed a lot of concern over this in Israeli media. So they feel that this can compromise their ability to strike Iran behind enemy lines, as it were, and for their deep and impactful spy rings that they have set up for decades in Iran. But the other thing that they're afraid of is that the system could be used for guidance of ballistic missiles. And they know that Iran is working on them. I would say, realistically speaking, Iran one day will have nuclear weapons. They will not advertise that they have nuclear weapons. In other words, they'll be just like Israel. They will not
I was
say
just
they
about to
have
say
them,
that.
but
You took the
everybody
words right
will
out of my
with
mouth.
yeah. So they will do exactly what Israel has done. So I think it's just a matter of time. Russia is certainly cooperating with them on a deeper level than even what you get from the news media. I'm very sure that uh, Russia probably even has a dark op project for helping them develop nuclear waste and so on that could be used. I'm almost certain of this, or they certainly have a threat that they could do that against Israel. Right? It's a card, right? You don't play all your cards at once, and it's better that the enemy never knows for sure. So that's the big concern, and I thought that was very interesting that these relations, especially the last 2 weeks, like uh, the cohesiveness between Russia and Iran, Russia and China, it's really starting to form a block now. And we've also discussed on this show the use of the Caspian Sea to deliver goods straight from Russia without ever having to go through Europe. or the Atlantic or the Mediterranean or the Red Sea. They just go directly by rail to the Caspian, from the Caspian down to Iran, and then it just goes into the Persian Gulf and goes to Asia. Not only is this 40% shorter, but it's also more economical. And the Caspian Sea now is it is one of the few bodies of water, maybe the only significant body of water that there is no American or NATO involvement at all. There is zero influence there, and that's a very interesting and strategic development.
Yes, as we get into more about the Caspian Sea, we do have just a hell of a story out of Kazakhstan that I really don't even know where to begin with for this time, so I will lay that aside for the moment. Just briefly before we get into Ukraine, I want to cover what many would have considered to be the big news of the week, which
Hmm.
is the FBI raid on Trump's residence in Mar-a-Lago. So they raided his residence allegedly to secure classified information that he took with them. Probably the most egregious thing I have is that they apparently took his letter from Kim Jong Un. They took a homie's letter, but things like that and things they said belong in the National Archives, and then claims that he allegedly downloaded nuclear secrets, which of course sent the media and the blue check class and the people obsessed with this kind of thing into an absolute tailspin. Just these allegations, of course, being the feds, they're never going to give you any definitive proof. Not that they, I think, even under the best of intentions, would be able to reveal something like that.
Hmm.
But there was a raid, and I'll just come around and say it. It's it's for 2024. It's theatrics now.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm not saying that because I think that this is some big plot that Trump's in on. I do think that Trump is tangentially in on the system, especially now that he has been processed through it.
I
And
mean,
we,
surely he knew that they would eventually do this, right?
oh, certainly, certainly.
Yeah.
And it does bring me to what are seemingly contradictory takes that can be reconciled. So, of course, the first is the very conventional take on the right that this is a political hit job, that they are trying to sabotage any future candidacy, any future of his political career. Admittedly, I would say that's the case, and that many people there would probably agree with that. I mean, Garland himself ordered the operation to take place. But I would also revisit our tentative theory we've been discussing probably since about the beginning of the year of Trump 2.0, how they're going to rehabilitate him and use him to do a lot of things that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do. That real housebroken Trump, so to speak. So you could speculate that this may be part of this. Maybe there's nothing results in this, but just because the stigma of an FBI raid and the possibility something like that may happen again, it's one of many things they can hold over his head. Now I'm sure they probably have much better things to hold over his head. For example, his massive debts to certain groups of people, as I'm sure many of you listening and possibly even myself also have quite a bit of debt to our resident users. But that's aside the point. Or just any of the number of things Trump has done in his life that you'd figure would warrant blackmail or being held over his head or being leveraged against him. And although I'm not going to say this outright because I think the story is still too new to make any definitive statements, I do think there is reason to suspect it is part of that attempted housebreaking of Trump, that attempted rebuilding of a Trump 2.0 in order to make him more compliant, in order to put him in there, in order to rally his base while doing the bidding of everything they stand against to an even greater extent than he did last time. Like I said, I would need to see a lot more. I'm going to need to see the fallout of this actually play out over the next couple weeks before I make any definitive statements like that. But on the surface, yes, I agree. People like Garland and the kind of people who run the FBI are doing this out of a grudge, doing this out of just complete political animus. But I also do think you could look at this from the angle that they are trying to once again use that to rebuild Trump in their image.
Right. There's a lot of things you could say about this. I mean, obviously, we've already said that Trump had to have known that this was eventually going to happen. Did he not announce it? I think he announced that they were going to raid his place anyways. But even if he didn't, surely he knew that this was inevitable, right? The more that he implies that he's going to run for president on Truth Social and whatnot, the more that they're going to start getting worried, particularly with the midterms coming up in a couple of months. Um, that is what they're preparing for. However, there are plans within plans, and there are more long-range plans. Um, I would guess that some in the American elites think that uh, it would be less harmful for America going forward to have Trump do his little, second term after a 4-year hiatus and get that over with, and then continue with the project rather than uh, having another event or two from now till 2024. And you'd have to think like this will go on to 2028. Um, an event like BLM summer, right? Because that surely will be there. If he's reelected, surely they will want another event like this. And so I think, American elites are probably as divided over this as anyone else. And I'm sure the argument to make sure that Trump does not run is probably what's safest for the regime going forward. I'm very, very sure that that is the most pervasive and persuasive argument that they have.
Oh, absolutely. And it will be interesting to see the fallout of this in the next couple of weeks to really see, or even just over the next couple of months, because this has already influenced the midterm elections. You have a lot of Republicans. Of course, there were the few rhinos, I guess, for lack of a better term, who said, "Well, oh, this is can only be understandable. Our intelligence agencies need to do what they need to do," like the Liz Cheney types, who come out in defense of this kind of thing.
Yeah.
Of course, the Dems were in lockstep about it, and the Republicans gave the usual limp-wristed response that you would expect. You had Kevin McCarthy, who's the House Minority Leader, finger-wagging, saying, watch out, FBI, because when we take back the House, we're going to make you sit through, questionings, and we're going to make you answer questions in front of Congress." Very terrifying stuff, I know. And perhaps another irony of this is that the director of the FBI currently is a Trump appointee, Christopher Wray. So that is, I suppose, only to be expected at this point. But I would say on the ground level in terms of voter to voter, and the right Republicans who will know how to play this in the media, this has already affected the midterms. This has caused, once again, a great degree of political polarization. You had protests outside of several FBI offices. You had an alleged attempting of breach and shooting at one of these, which I think turned out to just be, let's just
A guy
say,
with a nail gun.
yeah, something that turned out to just be completely nothing. You had people rallying, Trump supporters rallying outside of Mar-a-Lago, doing a demonstration in support of Trump and against the FBI. You've even had people who are, and of course, being media personalities, even online media personalities, they do have to toe a certain line. They do have audiences to impress, as do I, and I believe I impress you all each and every episode, and I'm very, thankful for that. But I think it was it was somebody associated with one of these like bigger online conservative, like a Crowder or somebody like that. Correct me if I'm wrong. Pretty much saying that the Republicans need to start campaigning on really like just tearing apart the intelligence agencies. Now, how much of that is rhetoric on his part, I can only speculate. But point being is, even if conservative pundits, even like on the online sphere, have to start saying that stuff to appeal to their base, that is becoming a growing sentiment within the population. That is becoming something that is embedded within the political culture at that point. Like I said, whether these people believe what they're saying or not, there are people listening to them who believe what they're saying. In which case, there's that. Of course, the perpetual talks of when will Americans trade blows with each other? When will they uh, go into the streets and turn this into a Weimar situation or even a civil strife 2.0, so to speak? I don't think it's going to go that far over one political figure, but it once again is showing what I've touched on the past couple episodes. I'm sure you remember my rant at the end of last episode about the irreconcilable differences that exist in this nation. That there is, I don't think, anything that could create the notion of a united American people as we had after 9/11. And even there were slips in the crack. There were people slipping through the cracks then. And I would say World War II is probably the best example. World War II is arguably the only time, and of course the post World War II era into the nifty 50s, was arguably the only time that really rich, genuine American identity existed that isn't what, for example, the colonial old stock may be. And by that, I mean, there's several anecdotes whether people come from some sort of ethnic backgrounds, like oh I left to Poland, came back an American. Like there's several variations of that. It's actually really interesting because the Cajuns, who at that time were still largely French speakers, it became a very common thing where Cajuns were quote unquote Americanized by their time in the service during World War II. So I'm once again getting off on a tangent as I tend to do, which I think adds a little bit of spice to the show, a little bit of variety, as they say.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but point being is, even in what and Kissinger actually made some comments about how we're closer to war with Russia and China that we've been since the Cold War. Even if there were to be some sort of conflict, I will once again reiterate that although something as trivial as debates over whether Trump is being unfairly persecuted or whether he's just an evil man who needs to be taken down, or just the myriad of opinions that exist about Trump in civil society, there's not one event that could foster that sort of identity, that American civic identity that really only exists during those exceptional times and really is the exception. And I would say it's probably a lack of historical knowledge where most people, especially when it comes to, say, the boomer generation who may have grown up in the fruits of that, for example, in the 1950s, early 1960s, before things really started to go to hell, where just subconsciously they think that's the norm. You look back, that American identity, so to speak, has only really been forged in those sort of times. And it is a bit of a diminishing return, and which leads me to believe that that American identity can be only forged so many times and only be forged so effectively before people just start outright rejecting it. Now, of course, they'll call themselves Americans, they'll say all these things, but saying something and actually embodying it and living up to it are completely different things. Where at this point, it's become almost wanting that broad American civic identity is something that has been labeled explicitly right wing, explicitly conservative, racist, or whatever term they're using at that time. We're to the point where the ruling regime has actually rejected that. And I think, once again, the Trump FBI raid crap that we just witnessed this week is just a microcosm of that. I don't think this is going to be the one thing that pushes over, but I do think it's a very useful example to understand a greater trend.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, and there are several things I think they're worried about, and one is it's obvious now that the GOP, I mean, I think it was obvious even in 2015 after the first debate, and then consequently all the other debates that followed in 2016, that the GOP and its message was over with. There was no way he could win. And, we've discussed on this program about, Finkelstein basically working with Mitt Romney first and then with Trump. And, what we heard Trump say in 2016 is what Mitt Romney was supposed to say. And Mitt Romney couldn't. And that's why Trump said he choked. But this move of this Overton window is something that does terrify them. They needed Trump, we've also discussed many times on this show, to get rid of the JPCOA, to move the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, to recognize the Golan Heights, and so on and so on and so on. And basically just to create an atmosphere that was more Israel friendly. You can consider, for instance, the amount of laws that states passed where they would not receive um, emergency funding, disaster relief funding, unless uh, those governmental organizations pledged fealty to Israel in a sense, right? Because they could not have any kind of anti-Israel sentiment, or they wouldn't get any help. 2020, the floods in Texas is the prime example. So, but that is what they had to do in order to achieve that, and now they have to clamp down on it. The problem is that the analysis for the kind of rhetoric that Trump adopted was spot on, but putting him away afterwards is not so easy. And if there's one thing about Trump, whether he likes it or not, I'm sure he's aware of it. He is this lightning rod for American discontent in the direction that America is going, particularly after Obama's second term. And if you look at, his big gatherings that he had, if you look at, I believe, the big gala dinner in New York for that Catholic organization, okay, where the Cardinal was present and so was Hillary. It was the night after at one of the debates where Trump called Hillary Clinton a nasty woman. There are some very funny segments in that, including when he says, her team got to meet my team that's trying to campaign and get me to win, and my team met her team. And in fact, some of them are right here. There's CNN, there's MSNBC, there's the New York Times, there's the Washington.
all the greatest
People
hits.
people were cracking up. However, he had a lot of knives out, and he said he brought up something about missing children, and he says Hillary probably knows something about that, like children gone missing from Haiti, because there was that huge, and that was swept under the rug. And one of the women involved in that later showed up dead. Um, so there was a lot of intrigue. Seth Rich. Um, there was another congressman, a black congressman, whose body was found on a beach in Florida for what's her name? Wasserman is her name. She was on the Hillary Clinton, um, not necessarily team like Mook, but when all the stuff about the email leaks came out, Wasserman was there to basically muzzle uh, um, uh, Bernie and to clear the way for her and to make a kind of a nothing out of the contents of the emails. But there was, I believe, a black congressman that was whose body was found in in her riding in Florida. We don't know what happened to him. He was murdered, but what did he know? Is there a connection? Anyhow, not to go off topic. So what Trump basically does is he unmasks them. You know, he brought up 9/11. he brought up all kinds of things that have a very rich life in the conspiratorial realm, and that isn't to negate some of the better aspects of that realm, right? Uh, we all know that new narratives are introduced in the conspiracy realm that are so ridiculous and people glob onto it that the hard work of like serious investigators is crippled essentially. So his role was he basically demasked the system, and or rather unmasked the system. And it was okay to ridicule that system. It was okay to ridicule Obama. It was okay to ridicule Hillary. It was okay to ridicule that agenda that even the GOP was also on, in as much as they were opposed to Trump. Um, so I think that's his basic significance, not his policies, but that he's a lightning rod even after January the 6th. Now, I think you'll get people who'll debate how effective he'll be or whether he can actually even win in 2024. That I think is still too far off. We don't know who's going to be running in 2024.
We
We
don't
don't
know if
know if there's
Biden will
even going to
still
be
be
an election in
kicking it.
2024. What's that?
We don't even know if Biden will still be kicking it, or we'll have President Kamala by then.
Yeah, yeah. There's just frankly too many unknowns. And I think you could even say, without too much irony, that we don't even know if we're going to have an election in 2024. Um, that's sort of how crazy things are. And as you said, the country is not divided, and I mean, is divided, and it can't work cohesively anymore.
Well, it's
We've
not divided;
often,
it's completely split.
yeah, that's right. So, what to make of it? I personally think that there's a good chance that Trump might not live to run for the office again.
Well, I find all the things you just said compelling. Just going over just a brief history of Trump's political career, and I think it can be very safely assumed that that wasn't the entire reason behind it, but a significant reason was he was, as you said, the lightning rod. And after a certain point, you mentioned J6, there came a time to retire him. And I think they wanted to do that quietly. I think they just wanted him to, go away, disappear, enjoy your presidential retirement fund, go back to Mar-a-Lago, play golf every day, do Donald Trump things. And there was that, but he kept running his mouth, hinting at 2024 runs, endorsing candidates, and
Mhm.
being an active political figure. And while I don't think your prediction that they might retire him is absurd, I don't think it's
Retire,
yeah,
retire.
I don't think it's on the table for the moment. But as you said, these situations can change rapidly. But at this point, I think between the FBI raid and everything that they've done and the banning of social media, is that they're trying to push him into obscurity. That his job is done. It's time for him to go away. He was that last hurrah. He was the one who serves the lightning rod, and almost in a way drew out our enemies into the light. He was something of a siren where he brought these people out. He brought the true opinion of these people, and it's a good head count for, I suppose you could say, distance, similar to the injection issue and the Ukraine issue as well, where the people, except we had this man in the White House, we had this man as a major political figure, and I do think whether it was a collaborative effort on his part or not, he was very useful for drawing the undesirables insofar as the regime is concerned out of the shadows.
Yeah, I mean that's what he did, and that's what had to be done in order to get a candidate that would do the kind of things that Israel wanted done. Of course, Israel didn't get everything that they wanted. One of the things I'm sure they wished that Trump would have done is to send in tens of thousands of troops into Syria and gotten rid of Assad and so on and so on. And that didn't happen. But and Trump was stymied one way or another when he wanted to reduce the amount of troops. And then, as I said, in 2019, he pulled some troops out. I mean, they were never completely gone. Let's be honest. And of course, he was apparently lied to, according to some of the people um, in his own administration, coming out after the his loss in the 2020 election.
Well, that's the time
That
when he really went out against John Bolton. Not that he had things to say about John Bolton after his firing, but I remember post election, that's when Bolton started writing his tell all book and started appearing in the media circuits, and Trump just completely tore into him, which admittedly, once again, was very satisfying to see, which is also part of, I hate to admit it, that Trump trap. He does those things to lure you in. Now, I'm not saying that if you support Trump, you're a dupe or you're stupid or anything, but I do think there has to be a real caution about uh, what he represents versus what he actually is.
hmm Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing that they're also scared of with Trump, okay, and this is why I think the faction that would do anything to stop him from running in 2024 is you notice that the GOP, they're getting pegged off, right? Um, I mean, there are like fake MAGA rebrands, but there's some residue of MAGAism in America that has permanently entrenched itself within the right, within the Republican Party of America. And I think for them, that's already worrying enough. Like for some of them, of course, there are some that understand that this kind of division in America will only become exacerbated. So it could be conceivable in the next 10 years that maybe Republicans will do FBI raids on Democrats or Democrat figures that are influencers. Who knows, right? Um, but I agree with you.
Look, I'm just saying, I
Americans.
can't wait for AOC to be live streaming her raid and like just like talking the way she is, like, they're raiding me, like like the kind of dumb videos that I'm sure you see all the boomers on your timeline post, like like it about her because they once again have, and that is part of the problem, that delving into the day-to-day electoral politics where it's like, look at what uh, this senator, this congressman with virtually no influence did today. So I mean, but point being is, I can imagine, especially as getting the age of social media, and I mean, we're only bound, and I can't wait for the 2022 crop of newly elected senators and congressmen to see what kind of frankly dumbasses get elected this time, and especially of that sort of AOC stripe, not necessarily ideologically, but just from that uh, late 20s, early 30s millennial sort of background where it's they are the Instagram candidates, I suppose you could call them. But
Mhm.
in all seriousness, you do bring up a good point about where we may get to a point, although they finger wag at it now, where Republicans might start using the organs of the state to enact these things to the degree that they can. Of course, they will never have that much influence as compared to the Democrats, but I mean, they'll still be able to pull a few strings here and there, maybe get some other organization that isn't the FBI to do it, maybe do a cleaning of house or whatever. But point being, just this continue race to the bottom and complete bifurcation of the American public. And even bifurcation would imply there's two sides of this. Now, there are generally two sides, but as this goes on, I think we're going to see more and more factions pop up. Now, I think there'll be two big tent organizations, but you see this with every movement, even down to like the dumbest online movement, just like the factionalism that develops where sure, Trump is the hot thing right now, but in the post-Trump era, perhaps you could get a debate, or maybe DeSantis is the real successor to his legacy, or maybe X, Y, or Z is the real successor to his legacy, and those camps dividing on each other. You see this very openly in the Democratic Party a lot. The Republican Party, to its credit, insofar as an organization is concerned, is much better about cracking the whip about those sort of things, because even all the Republicans who threaten saying, oh, I don't know what I'll do if Trump's the nominee, fell right in line. And again, so that does take great organizational skill. Just in a vacuum, I do have to give them credit for that. But it is going to be a continued trend of the, for lack of a better word, politicization of American society that leads to these sort of things that just leads to absolute dysfunction. And maybe if we get more renegade governors, we'll see the federal government take more and more of a backseat on these sort of things.
Yeah, so I mean, I think they are afraid of those things primarily because, as we've discussed on this show, they have a direction where America is going to go, particularly about white demographics and also about, sexual mores and what children are taught. Now, they know how emboldening Trump's rhetoric will be. You can just imagine that if he runs, he's going to say, Roe v. Wade, that was me. I mean, not he doesn't go to church. I mean, let's be honest, but he's going to use that, and people will just gobble it up. I mean, they'll just love it. And he did stop critical race theory in some states, and even after he disappeared, some states found the courage basically to resist it, and that has started the unofficial balkanization of America, where you have um, people who just don't feel comfortable living in California and are probably Republican or consider themselves conservative moving to Idaho, right? Now you've got shitlibs who are following them because they're desperately afraid. I mean, if there's one party that does not want to see America balkanized or any center of conservatism that's strong or just not as weak as it is in New York,
It's
it'll
the
be
white
them.
shit lib.
They're the ones who have the most to lose from this sort of steady, unofficial balkanization and just general kind of division and malaise of the American spirit. Like I think like it would be very hard right now for America to engage in a war on the scale of Iraq anywhere. The unity is not there, and they simply don't have enough white boys that are willing to die. And we've discussed on the show, like you could utilize Trump to do that. Now, he would have to do it, you know, this is a scary proposition, but I imagine it would have to be something like, let's say, calling China's bluff and setting up a base in Taiwan. Uh, Maybe it'll be some kind of setting up another base somewhere in Indonesia because of what's the name of those straits where trade goes through? Um, there's, it could even be working closely with Poland again. But there is no other figure that could convince white young men, to join the army. And he's not even really that good at it, if you know what I mean.
Oh
Because
yes.
his message really was more about containing and confronting China than it was had anything to do with the Middle East and Russia. Even though he worked against Nord Stream 2, he was the first president to arm Ukraine with lethal weapons, not defensive weapons. He increased spending dramatically. Um,
And not to mention all the shenanigans of the Ron, such as the JCPOA, the seizing of oil tankers, etc.
right. So it's limited, and the real battle for America is not out there; it's in America itself. And I just think the more pragmatic, Democrat elitists basically see him as a very, very big problem. They have only one course, and that is to absolutely crush not just him, but in the process, crush any hope for this kind of politics, particularly isolationism, and particularly through roundabout ways dealing with white issues.
Yes, and not to linger on this too much because
Man,
this
do we have so much more to go.
yes, because as I said, this is kind of the minor news of the week, all things considered. But you did make a point, especially about getting recruitment numbers up, that Trump, although it's somebody they detest, although it's somebody that I think they would like to see gone, and maybe even another Trump, like a DeSantis type figure, or whoever they find to fill his shoes, they need somebody who a Trump-like figure, maybe not even Trump himself, and preferably not Trump himself, that they can outsource their dirty work for that kind of thing too. And that's fun. That
Right. And now Trump can only come in to raise um, figures for the military, right? That can only happen in an actual war, because the whole reason of Biden coming in was to purge any uh, particularly white American boy that liked Trump and his message. This is why they had the COVID vaccine mandate rule. They are there to make joining the military the most humiliating um, prospect that any young man, let's say 25 and under, who voted for Trump or is a Trump supporter, could ever have, as an experience goes.
yeah, the boys
So
from
it could
rural
only
Arkansas and
be for an
Indiana who
actual
make up the
wartime
bulk.
effort.
Yeah, the boys from rural Arkansas and Indiana who actually make up the bulk of like the people actually like active duty like combat soldier.
Right, because remember, I mean, all that talk about America's, greatest danger is white rage and insurrection. Now, I know the January 6th insurrection is actually to hide the BML, BLM uh, insurrection, as it were, of the entire culture that went on for 4 months. That was to mask that. Right? They're trying to make January 6th the thing that you remember in that 12-month period from January 2021 to, let's say, May 2020, right? That's what they want you to remember is the event, the defining event, not BLM, not like the several dozens of people who were killed and the total chaos, not that, which went on for 4 months. No, those goofballs who went in and one of them took a poo in Pelosi's office, or AOC's shoes were stolen. No, so it's a fake event, as it were, to hide the real event and change the memory of the people. That's the whole point of it. Um, so the military has had to be one of those things that it had to be purged of those kind of guys, right? Because that is what they're most afraid of. In a sense, they're already telling you we're not going to go to war out there. We're going to have to use either nukes, or we're going to have to use mercenaries or other countries willing to die, uh, in the tens of thousands to get whatever it is that we've promised them.
Well, that's the perfect segue for the minutia minute, and I'll go ahead and pull up
Yes,
our maps for the audience while you give a brief rundown on some of the major events that
brief.
actually came out of Ukraine this week. Let me just, I'm, let's see, and they are right here. So there we go. There's your general map of Ukraine, and take it away.
Well, I'm going to start from the south, and this time in Crimea. And I mean, the one of the big news items concerning the Ukraine war has been uh, the explosions. At least 9 to possibly 11 explosions that happened at a military Air Force base called Saki, which is very close to Sevastopol, Crimea. It's on the shore, as it were. Uh, Now, there were a lot of videos that I saw, and I didn't see anyone. because there's if anybody is on Telegram and you're on one of these Telegram channels that you follow, when missiles are flying by, like you will not be surprised, or you will be, I guess, if you're not accustomed to it. Um, all kinds of videos of people recording the sky and a missile just flying by over the rooftops before it hits. And uh, about 10 of these missiles and not one recorded tells me there were no missiles. And this is where things become strange and ever more perplexing. And I would say for the Russians, uh, ever more worrisome. The photos that I've seen also don't indicate, like, there's only one explosion that is just outside of the plane, right? All the planes that have been knocked out, and initially they were saying it was something like two Su 25s. Then I heard it was an Su 25 and an Su 30. But as the news gathered, it looked like there were about 9 planes that were affected, that were severely damaged. Now, there have been mishaps like this. There was a mishap like this in Syria a few years ago, with the Russians losing some of their planes like this. It had to do with loading ammunition on the planes. And recently there was something like that happened in Belarus. But that doesn't necessarily mean that is what happened, right? So I think a lot of channels have talked about it. The Duran, of course, has talked about it, saying, and I tend to agree with them, that there just isn't there's just no um, empirical evidence for missile strikes. And no matter how accurate missiles are, they're not really that accurate. I mean, they have between, let's say, 5 to 20 meters where they can hit or miss. Okay. And in a distance of over 200 kilometers, that will probably increase. So I doubt very much that about 10 missiles, like except for one, uh, pinpoint accuracy hit these planes. And like if they were hit, like they would be much more obliterated than they look, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
So then that leaves, and of course, there's no recording of any of these things, right? And 10, 11 missiles is a lot of missiles for no one to record as they're laying about, on the beach, doing selfies, talking to friends. Um, like I say, there's even the people, because it's happening in a concentrated area, and you don't have, like, as they're filming it, there's no third or fourth or fifth or sixth or seventh or eighth, whatever amount of missiles that hit in that area. Now, when I've watched, uh, strikes that the Russians have done in Nikolaev or Kharkov or a few months back in Kiev, you do see that, right? But you don't see that with the video footage. So that means basically either it was an accident or it's sabotage. Um, it's possible it's sabotage because, on Russia's, like, Navy Day, a small drone with a little explosive dropped the explosive somewhere in Sevastopol. No one was hurt. There was, I think, a window that was blown out or damaged, but this was a very small explosive. In any case, it was there just to say that, we have people sympathetic to our cause in Crimea right now. You are infiltrated. So it's possible that that someone sympathetic to the Ukrainian cause within the Russian military uh, had, bungled this thing intentionally so that this mishap would cause these explosions of missiles that were being loaded onto the planes, or perhaps there were small explosives that were put under the wings that were later, with the time, were blown up. Um, I don't know. That would be difficult to pull off.
Now, I will. present a counter theory. Not that I'm discounting any sort of sabotage, even though I am just going through my head right now trying to figure out who would be a prime candidate to be committing sabotage, but this war is unlike anything we have ever seen. This is the largest ground war since the end of World War II, and
Yeah.
frankly, the largest air war since the end of World War II. And when it comes to these fourth, and even some cases fifth generation aircraft, these are complex multi-million dollar machines that are being used on a scale that we've never seen before. And
Hmm.
it does make me wonder that if that's the case, they probably need to bring on a new crew. And I don't remember what the ratio is, like how many men you need to actually operate one of these things, like aside from just the pilots and the actual operators of the aircraft, like how many people you need to actually maintain and prepare these weapons. But it could just be that they're just drawing from the ranks, and it's just people who are not experienced with handling fighter aircraft or technology of this caliber. I think that's another distinct possibility. That's just a
Incompetence.
bunch of Greens who are roped into this because that's where they're needed, and they don't really know what they're doing yet.
Hmm. Well, I mean, about a month ago, I brought up on the show that there were two SUs, an SU-35 and an SU-34, that were shot down by Russian S-300 systems, and there was speculation that now this was so far into Russian-held territory that it was on the border of Russia itself where it happened. Um, that frankly, the Buk system and the S-300 systems, the few of those that the Ukrainians still have, it's not going to go after aircraft that is that far away when Russia's Crocodile helicopters and Su-25s that are flying every day in the Donbass. You know what I mean? They wouldn't target they wouldn't target a plane, 100 kilometers way out from where the action is. So incompetence is definitely a possibility, and that should also be worrying for Russia. I mean, really, the explosions are, uh, if you've seen them, they're quite large, and it's startling, right? Because it's happening in Crimea. Um, I don't know what to say. Whether it's incompetence or they're infiltrated, it's very bad news. It's a bad look. Definitely, Russia has lost on the PR level. Now, I don't know if any of the planes were all that valuable. Some of them, I mean, they're all valuable, but Russia has so many of them. Um, and it's not like some of their, let's say, like the TU bombers, strategic bombers. Those, the White Swans, they only have about 10 of those. So it's not like they lost one of those, right? That's what I'm trying to say. Um, so is that is Crimea. Now we'll go a little further north into
I
Kherson.
will just say one last thing
Mm,
about that
yep.
is it is completely reasonable to expect that Crimea, which is an annexed territory and has been the focus of the past 8 years of conflict, is a hotbed of infiltrators and espionage.
Yes, yes. I'm just saying, like, I no matter how lackadaisical the Russians might be about this stuff, and I don't think they are. Like, if it was sabotage, right, they would have to be in the military itself. If they're outsiders doing this, right, it's one thing to get like a $75 drone and attach like a homemade bomb, like that drops it from like 40 feet up in the air. Like that's one thing. And it's quite another to plant like sophisticated bombs that like make a huge impact from like 5 miles away. You can see these explosions. It's quite another thing to get, an individual or individuals to go underneath all these aircrafts, and plant the bombs and then blow them up one after the other. Like it's a lot of work. You're going to get noticed, I think.
Oh yeah,
Like
certainly, and I'm not ruling out any instances of sabotage or malice, but once again, I think it comes down to
I'm
this.
arguing for a certain kind of sabotage. It wouldn't be like an outsider.
Yes,
This there wasn't a SEAL team that went in and did this, right? It's not Call of Duty. Um, this is somebody like if it's sabotage, it's somebody within the military itself. It's somebody that is not going to raise suspicion.
yes, I would agree with that as well. And um, one interesting thing to look at, I don't have the numbers of the figures, and I don't imagine they'd be anywhere near Crimea at this point. Is how many of the Ukrainians military personnel who were in Crimea sided with Russia, and like again, that could be a question of like there's just so many angles to look at that, and again, like I've heard about some of this, but this is the first like real exposure I had to any of this, so it does raise a lot of alarm bells. But if I had to give a general take on it, and I'll hand it over to you back on this, is this is the first war of its kind, and there is probably an alarming amount of people who don't really know what they're doing because of that.
Right. Well, I mean, just a day or two before Putin launched the special military operation, there was like he's Russian actually. There was a Russian guy that was suspected of promulgating, Nazism, and he was arrested. And this was just days before the war got started. So there's no doubt that there are sympathizers, uh, there and particularly in southern Ukraine. Let's not forget last week in Melitopol, the mayor was assassinated. So these networks do exist. So I mean, we'll probably never know for sure whether this was incompetence. Like, there are other examples, as I said, where this happened in Syria and in Belarus just this year. And you can see satellite imagery if you're in Telegram. I think it's one or two planes that were affected. Or it could be sabotage, and it could be somebody deep within the system itself that is doing this. Anyhow, so I'll move over to now to Kherson region and the great Kherson counteroffensive has still not happened. It was never going to happen, and all kinds of silly reasons have been made. A few weeks ago, the Ukrainians said we faked out the Russians, and it forced them to diverge uh, some of their military personnel from the Donbass into southern Ukraine. Now, that is true that that did happen, and that is a tactic that all armies use. But in order to make, if that was the reason why they did what they did, what the problem is that they committed an unforced error, and that is they took their artillery with them, and for this reason they lost Pesky. Pesky now is officially completely under the control of the Russians, and a lot of the sources that I'm reading are saying Pesky is as important to the front right now in the southern Donbass as Popasnaya was in the northern Donbass front, which was the prelude to taking Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. Essentially, what taking Pesky means is the second most fortified installation by the Ukrainian army over the last 8 years. Avdiivka is still the most, but this is probably the second most. uh, no one has been living there since 2015. I mentioned on the show last week that this was a town that got traded back and forth several times between the rebels and the Kiev forces. But essentially, what it does is it bifurcates on the south, Marinka, and on the north, Avdiivka. And I think Krasnodarsk is also close to Marinka on the south. So that is what has happened. By moving their artillery out of the way, it allowed the Russians to break through in Pesky. I do tend to think that they were actually serious about attacking uh, Kherson. And the main reason for this is because it's the only area where the Russians are on the other side, on the western side of the Dnieper River. And it is a huge foothold. And it is something that they know as winter approaches that this can be the launch head for the Russians to go west of the Dnieper, particularly Nikolaev and Odessa. That will be actually harder because there are more rivers there. But what they're afraid of is uh, losing Zaporizhia because of a northeast movement up the Dnieper. Because Zaporizhia is a big town. It is much bigger than Mariupol. It's smaller than Kharkov. It's smaller than 1 million, but it's bigger than 500,000, as far as I understand. And it has a river on the other side of it, and it means that the attacker is forced to attack frontally. Now, if the Russians got on the other side of the river, Zaporizhia is not that difficult to take. And the Zaporizhia is going to be one of those regions which are going to have votes for joining the Russian Federation very soon. And it's the same case with Kherson. And that's, I think, the other reason why they wanted to launch a counteroffensive. They know that they have to take these areas back because it's a massive, massive bridgehead into taking other potential areas. And it is forcing them to divide their resources between the Donbass and this area that if the Russians break through, and the Russians aren't really trying to break through in this area, again, is to force the Ukrainians it's getting inside the heads of the Ukrainians, right? Many of them already suspect that they're going to lose the Donbass eventually, and that the theater of conflict is going to move westward. And they don't want Russians on the west side of the Dnieper. So there was also a New York Times article basically that said as much, that it doesn't look like there's any counteroffensive. We've discussed that it's very difficult and even to have an offensive in this area because of it's so flat, and the Ukrainians have literally begun to severely run out of armored fighting vehicles and also tanks.
And just
Um,
resources in general.
yes, a lot of the conscriptors, the conscriptees that are being sent to fill in the gaps, they have no heavy armor with them. I mean, they probably have some mortar units, a few javelins. Everything else is just machine guns and assault rifles. So um, that has not worked, and this has forced also Ukraine in its infinite wisdom to continue to attack Novakhovka, where there is a big dam that has a generator for electricity. Um, One of the bridges was damaged, but from what I've seen, cars are still driving on it. There are three major holes. I would say, how big are the holes? It would be probably um, bigger than a beach ball, let's say. Um, so the shelling of these bridges, the logic is that if they do that, it'll stop the Russians from being able to transport more military equipment. But the problem is the bridgehead that the Russians established very early on in the war in Kherson has a lot of options for them, and they are so deep in on the other side of the Dnieper that it's not going to be like crossing the Severodonetsk River, where the forces are literally on the other side of the river and they can't wait for you to try to cross it. In this case, they are anywhere from 50 to 100 kilometers away, and crossing it is going to be easy. It'll be slower, but it will be possible. The other big news in southern Ukraine, of course, is the shelling of the nuclear power plant in um, the Zaporozhye region. And this has gone all the way to the UN. Uh, the Western media has gone out of its way to conceal who is doing the shelling when it's obvious that it's the Ukrainians. They're trying to blame it on the war. Of course, Ukraine is looking for a way to get the UN to create a frozen conflict in that area. And they want that soon because the referendums for joining Russia are coming up as well. Now, apparently, the Russians, like, honestly, I get sources that are saying the Russians have or have not turned off the energy from this nuclear power plant to the rest of Ukraine. But the Russians are still feeding gas into Ukraine anyways. So it's not like the Russians could be much more severe on Ukraine if they wanted to. So the energy from other sources I've seen are saying that um, the energy coming out of the the nuclear power plant are now on the Russian grid, and that is working towards supplying energy for Russian held territory in southern Ukraine. Now, the attacks, like I've seen the office spaces where missiles have hit. Um, Apparently, there was one death and 9 injuries. Um, and the Ukrainians' claim, of course, has been that the Russians are launching missiles from there. There is Russian military there, but for the same reasons that there is Russian military patrolling areas of the Saki military air force base that we just discussed in Crimea, right? They are afraid of saboteurs because the Ukrainians actually did hold themselves up in the Zaporozhye. I don't know if you remember, but in the early days of the war, they were firing from there and they were hiding inside this nuclear power plant until the Russians cleared them out.
Yes, I remember that was back in March, the point where it was so undeniable that even media outlets were acknowledging that it was the Ukrainians who started the instant, the almost instant at the power plant.
Yes, yes. There wasn't the kind of cooperation that there was at Chernobyl in February, but eventually the Russians took it. So the Russians have no reason to hide their mobile missile launch systems in the nuclear power plant. Okay, uh, the Ukrainians have lost so much military materiel that the Russians don't have to really worry that much about getting hit. Now you'll find videos, and it'll say date and location uncertain, where a Russian military launch system is attacked successfully and destroyed. But for the most part, the Russians don't have to worry about it, and they're not firing from there. They have far more to lose. They're not in the desperate situation that Ukraine is in. Uh, we've heard now the fifth time that the Russians are running out of bullets and missiles. Remember, but no such thing has occurred. So, um, so that's the big deal happening in the South. Now we move east, and as I said, the major breakthrough is that there have been small incremental gains by the Russians all along the Donbass front, along Donetsk in the north and the south, and they have taken Pesky. Recall that, for instance, Zelensky said that it's horrible, it's living hell for the troops there. There was a day where even the Ukrainians admitted that they lost roughly about 1,000 men. Well, that's over. And if anybody saw the videos of the TOS system, these are, again, mobile rocket launch systems, but they only have like an area of 2 to 4 kilometers, but they are absolutely devastating. Nothing is going to survive within 50 meters of impact. Um, So that has been taken, and now there is fighting in Avdiivka. I mean, there always was, but the Russians are now, I should say actually, that's the Donbass forces that are in the outskirts there. Uh, a good chunk of Marinka, at least 45%, has been taken. That is southwest of Donetsk. And all of this is happening underneath, the area of Bakhmut and Kramatorsk. Further north, the Ukrainians today shelled uh, Gorlovka that killed three civilians. They hit a residential area. The other day, they hit a brewery in Donetsk, which released ammonia. The Ukrainians now are very, very desperate to inflict as much damage on civilians as possible. They know that they cannot sustain the front line, that incrementally the Russians, in order to save the lives of their soldiers, are absolutely pounding them with artillery. Um, at this point, I just want to bring up a very interesting take that I saw on Twitter. Cthulhu, I think it's not his full name, but part of the name is Cthulhu. And, he talked about the Russian air campaign that could have been a greater success, but wasn't. In the early part of the war, the Russians completely destroyed the first ring of air defenses for Ukraine. Um, and of course, they used electronic warfare as well in order to do this. It took on a lot of S-300 systems and Buk systems, but not all of them. And so they didn't capitalize um, on the gains that they had made. If it were the Americans, according to this poster, and I think he's right, they would have sent in very fast-moving jets, and they would have knocked out these targets in the first 2, 3 days of the war, when Ukraine's communication lines were destroyed and generally getting themselves back on their feet had not happened. But the Russians never took advantage of this, and they sent in helicopters, and of course there was a large loss of helicopters, also jets as well. But I thought that was a very interesting point. And so now it's mostly the artillery and missiles that are taking care of air defense systems in Ukraine. But the Russians and Ukrainians are probably the best artillery armies in the world, if you ask me.
Yes, I would.
All you have to do is their accuracy is phenomenal, and they're doing it really with you know cannon systems that are decades old. Like, they're not as sophisticated, but they're so competent with them.
And once
Both
again,
sides.
referencing things that are unprecedented, this has to be the first time we've seen consistent artillery duels, probably once again since the end of the Second World War. Now,
Yeah,
there are isolated examples, maybe the Iran Iraq War, perhaps, but to this scale, I would say
yeah.
this has been something that we have not seen happen since 19, 1945,
Hmm.
1944. And
Hmm.
of course, this is all in the age of when someone can pull a camera out of their pocket and have it all documented within a matter of minutes and put on whatever social media platform. So it is. I don't think people realize how truly unprecedented the scale of this war actually is.
Yeah. Yeah. The other progress that's happening in the Donbass is the Russians now have taken at least half of Solidar, which is in a sense like a suburb of Bakhmut. And they are no longer on the outskirts of Bakhmut or in the suburbs. They are now in parts of the city proper. Fighting is very fierce. There are losses on both sides. The Ukrainians have started moving men from Seversk, way up in the north, not too far from Lysychansk, close to the Severodonetsk River. This is an area that they've held in order to stop an encirclement, but now they are being forced to keep Bakhmut. Remember, when Zelensky traveled to Donbass, it is to Bakhmut that he went to try to encourage the soldiers back in June before Lysychansk fell. So there's a lot of symbolic battles that are happening right now, and Slavyansk will be another city eventually that will have all kinds of symbolic um, meaning for a lot of people. Um, and this I want to have a segue here. So there have been, speaking of Slavyansk, because there's a little book out called 185 Days in Slavyansk or 85 Days in Slavyansk. Strelkov, Igor Strelkov, or Gurkin, when he was there, and the Russians are quite mixed on this, and I'm so glad because a few months ago, even Joel Davies was harping on about Gherkin and or Strelkov, by his call sign, and he was an authority. He was going to tell you that the Russians were not faking taking Kiev; they really were going to take Kiev. I mean, they're finally, like, I see more and more cartoons ridiculing him. One, he's incredibly pessimistic. Two, they're angry that he rage quit and left Donbass when he couldn't get the full kind of control over the forces that he wanted. Second of all, people always said that he was too ambitious and the forces weren't strong enough, and that he wasn't really that great of a leader. And the latest now is, and our friend Arestovich.
I was just about to bring him up. I said I was just about to say I would love to see an hour conversation between those two. I'd pay $1,000 for it.
So Arestovich made up this lie that Strelkov went to Crimea in order to join the front in Kherson in disguise. I, I love Arestovich. He's insane. Like, he just literally makes up this shit, and people fall for it, right? I mean, Strelkov was an older guy in 2014, 8 years ago. He's not gonna go fight now, and the Russians don't even want him there. They wouldn't even let him. They think he's a problem. Okay, he's not gonna go. And they had a photoshopped face. Obviously it's somebody else, but they photoshopped Strelkov's face on it. His arms are crossed. He's wearing like a wife beater shirt and a t-shirt, and it's just ridiculous, right? But it's amazing that Arestovich said that. Um, and I'll get to Arestovich as I wrap up the minutia minute. The only thing that isn't has not been static is north of Kharkov. A small village called Umi has been taken by the Russians. So the Russians now are pressing closer to Kharkov. Again, I do not think that this is an attempt to take Kharkov. This is strictly to fix the amount of Ukrainian forces in that region that they cannot divert toward Donbass, right? Just like, as I said earlier, that thread on Twitter about how Russians didn't maximize their use of the Air Force. However, despite that, the amount of forces that they had in the north and south, it claims, kept the Ukrainians from reinforcing the East. And so I look at these as fixing and fake operations, basically, uh, to make it easier on the Donbass and Lugansk People's Republics fighting the Ukrainians that are literally like on their doorstep. That's how close they are, the Donetsk line.
Like I can tell you, as somebody who has the greatest, most enriching experience, which gives tells you all you need to know about warfare and strategy of having played Axis and Allies. That's just something you do. You do diversions. You set you bait your enemy. That's a huge part of warfare, going back to the beginning.
Yeah, you get into their head, right? If they always have to react to you, they're going to lose, right? Uh, I mean, the Russians literally used like a Mongol tactic in Kharkov when they moved out. The Ukrainians went into those villages, they took over them, and then they had heavy losses as the Russians began to form a cauldron around the areas that they took them. But again, taking these three villages. One of them is named Umi. No, they're not going to. Kharkov is 1.1 million people. Yes, I know 40-50% have already left. But it's a sprawling metropolis. Not huge in numbers, but very wide in space. And that's it for the minutia minute. I'm very sure I've missed something. All I can say is uh, attacks on the civilians are ongoing. Less of those pedal bombs, but more instances of kids, unfortunately, stepping on pedal bombs, which means that their leg is going to be amputated. Um, but overall, less than the kind of death toll that we saw in July and June. And that's partly because they're being pushed back. But that's it for the minutia minute. As far as other Ukrainian news, um, Arestovich went for a walk in Old Kiev with one of his buddies that he does these interviews with. It's not the overweight guy with the scruffy beard. It's the other guy with the very small eyes, who's um, he doesn't have a beard. He's very chiseled looking. And Arestovich says to him, if Zelensky does, because I think next year is an election year, if Zelensky doesn't run, I will run. he said, I love myself. He literally said that. Arestovich reminds me of Richard Spencer in many ways.
Well,
Like,
it's I see that, but it's like a combination between like a Spencer and a Trump, and it's fantastic.
it is fantastic. He's so hilarious. He's so calm. He really is Baghdad Bob in that respect. Like the whole thing could be burning down. He's still going to be calm. And so, anyways, he said that, and one of the comments I read on this Telegram post was, "Who is this narcissistic peacock?" It was written in Russian, but
Well, that honestly sounds like something Arestovich would call himself.
so I thought that was interesting. And then in a Polish paper, they had a big spread right on the front page, and they had Zaluzny, and they're claiming, yeah, this is in Gazeta Wyborcza, Gazeta Wyborcza, and they're talking about what's his future? Polish newspaper with signature, the first Atman. Yeah, they're calling him the first Atman of Ukraine. So there's been a lot of talk about maybe Zelensky getting replaced, maybe Zelensky getting offed. That talk has been going on for a month now. I don't know what to say. I think the Americans are so invested in him. When they did the Vogue spread, I mean, that to me was a sign that the Americans do not want anyone else to take over Ukraine, because that will delegitimize everything. Even if that person, whoever it is, takes over Zelensky, is doing the same thing Zelensky does, their PR efforts to create a new, PR buzz for a new leader, especially if the war drags on, is going to be ever more difficult. Uh, Primarily because elections are happening, winter is coming. We'll get into the whole, energy problems of Germany and Europe very soon. But so I thought that was interesting that there's little hints, there's little stories here and there in European papers about other potential leaders. We'll see. I personally think so far they're nothing burgers.
Yes, and as you said, there is some news about Europe and the ongoing energy situation, but just a few items in brief because I do know we are running a little long. There is a situation in Kazakhstan where they plan on phasing out the Russian language as an official language over the next 6 years. So it does appear, at least right now, that there's attempts to reignite what they tried to do at the beginning of the year, the color revolution that was swiftly put down by Russia. So Kazakhstan is likely going to be a hotbed in the future. We also have news out of Armenia with Nagorno Karabakh and Azerbaijan. So this all comes in the light of Armenia seeking to normalize relations with Turkey. Since September, there has been over 500 phone calls since between Turkish and Armenian officials, and there's been several ceasefires in Nagorno Karabakh, which is leading to at least a public PR campaign of trying to delegitimize the Russian peacekeepers, saying why aren't they doing more, which does make you wonder whether it's a PR campaign from the anti-Russia camp trying to say they need to get out of here because they're not doing anything, or whether it's a more pro-Russia campaign appealing to the Russians to have their peacekeepers do more. And once again, with both of those stories, it is that attempt to open multiple fronts on Russia's side to try to bleed it out, as they're trying to do in Ukraine right now. So those are developing again, and Nagorno Karabakh has been unstable ever since the initial peace agreement, and it's really only a matter of time before that conflict sparks. And I'm not going to make any definitive predictions on it, but I wouldn't be surprised if that happened towards the end of this year if we start to see it go in that direction, similar to September, October 2020 is when it broke out last time, lasted to about November. I wouldn't be surprised if we get another short-term conflict there it, sometime this year.
Yeah, and I mean, Blinken, I think, was in Armenia not too long ago. I think the Americans are going to try to court the Armenians now and force the Russians in a kind of divided position between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and of course Turkey is in that mix as well. Um, but the fact of the matter is uh, first of all, Azerbaijan works with Israel, and America has always been interested in pulling Azerbaijan away because of its oil and gas deposits and because of
Yes, and
its
they just signed that deal with the European Union a few days
mm,
back
mhm.
to deliver natural gas to Europe.
Yeah, if anything, I mean, Blinken's visit is virtually pointless. He's probably there to give them a false hope. Who knows? He might even be setting them up. But in any case, it's basically there to put Russia in a bind, into making negotiate Russia being the facilitator of peace and trying to work out negotiations in the conflict more difficult.
Yes, I would agree with that, and I'm sure there will be more news on that in the following weeks. But those were just your brief news items, and getting into really the last thing I think we'll be able to fit in today is the ongoing European energy crisis. Now, the Baltic pipeline, in the simplest terms possible, is completely dry, which means Ukraine is now getting more gas than Poland is. A country Russia is in an armed conflict with is getting more energy access than countries that aren't even in an armed conflict with Russia. It's a bit wild to think about. And of course, the situation in Germany continues. Schloss is saying, "Well, it's going to be hard, but of course we can weather the winter." Blah blah blah. Of course, he's embroiled in his own sex scandals right now, so he is not in a very good position. And the UK, from some of the headlines I saw this week and some of the articles I read this week, is quickly becoming the new Germany in the sense that it is about to be heavily impacted by the energy crisis. You already have set for January 2023 planned blackouts and energy rationing on the part of the UK government. And this is with an outgoing prime minister. Found they still haven't nominated a successor to Johnson, so he is still in there until the Conservative Party officiates his successor. And so that policy could change, but I doubt it. It seems like something that just goes beyond whoever is in the seat of leadership, at least insofar as that capacity is concerned. So you have them preparing for the worst with that. You have Germany once again saying for the 50th time, this is going to be our last 2 weeks of having energy, even though, not to downplay the situation, because they are tapping heavily into their energy reserves right now, and they are quickly depleting. Of course, there's more talk of returning to the nuclear, and even that, as we discussed, wouldn't necessarily be a problem because of how many, how much nuclear material, whether it's to build the plants or even the uranium itself, comes from Russia. So you would have that problem with sanctions as well. And the UK economy is also tanking because of sanctions. And although you might not think on the surface the UK and Russia were that great of economic partners, it's just those many things that once again come out of Russia that so many countries are relying on, so many of these resources that come out of Russia, whether they're sold to them by third parties. And as we've also discussed, I'm sure you've seen, countries like India are buying Russian oil and reselling it to Western markets. You also saw the situation in Egypt where it's bought and resold to Western markets to get around the sanctions using these third party countries that are not sanctioning Russia. So it looks like the UK and Germany come winter. I mean, we're at the end of summer right here. It's August 13th as we're recording this, and this episode should be out by August 14th. So, looking 2, 3 months down the road, especially as things start to get colder, especially as the climate in Europe, of course, North America is a much warmer continent and a much sunnier continent than Europe, especially Northern Europe. So, once we reach late October, we're going to see how serious these claims are. And I honestly hate to say this. I'm not reveling in this. I know I make a lot of jokes about these sort of things. I'm afraid that these claims that they put out may be underestimations to mitigate the population's uh, backlash to these sort of news. Like, we're just going to have some blackouts. We're just going to have some planned blackouts, or we'll be able to weather the winter, don't worry. It seems as if they're trying to ease them into a situation that is much worse than
Hmm.
they're letting on.
Right, because Russian oil exports now are basically back to where they were before the war got started, and it profits are even higher, um, even though production was generally lower in the 5, 6 months into this year. So I've seen projections, as you say, on British media about like £5,000 to heat your home. Uh, really horrible projections economically where things are going to go, and the projections that are coming out in German newspapers about where the economy is going to go in Germany are even more dire. I mean, they are predicting that there are going to be riots. They're going to be far worse than anything they saw during the COVID lockdowns, and they've said openly, the government has said, we will not have enough police in such an event, and we will have to rely on the military. So, um, this makes you hearken back to those words that Putin said way back in April and early May that the energy problems for the West will increase, and you'll see a lot of instability in Europe in the coming year, and even possible regime changes. That's, I mean, he's not wrong. Uh, I can say at least that they're already scrambling now. Um, you have all kinds of cases where there was a forest fire in Poland, and that's burnt up uh, wood fuel that Poles are allowed to take with them. They cannot cut any trees, but anything that's fallen is allowed to be taken. As you say, I think we are going to see a kind of hysteria at in the middle of September that is going to be fever pitch, and it will only get worse.
While I'm on the
It
trend
will
of
be,
making bold predictions, I will say that we're going to see movements that make the yellow vests look like child's play.
yeah, yeah. Um, there isn't going to be a super weapon that the Americans will be able to put inside Ukraine. You know, they put in like 16 HIMARS. They think like people who closely follow the Western press think 16 HIMARS are going to like change the battleground, just like the M777s. Like well, the Russians have now claimed an eighth HIMAR has been destroyed, and people are like shocked. How could that happen? It's like, I mean, it's a truck. It's just a truck with a launch platform on the back. Like it's not a stealth plane. It's a friggin' truck. It's so ridiculous. I mean, the Russians have air superiority. Anyhow, not to get off topic, but um, what I'm worried about is what they're willing to do in order to stop this from continuing, because I don't think they're going to stop at Zaporozhye, right? Like the Ukrainians constantly bombing the nuclear power plant in Zaporozhye is them literally saying, yes, it will cause a fallout. Yes, it will even harm us, but it's better than being under Russian rule. And I mean, they're not going to be under Russian rule. They're just not going to get those parts of Ukraine that they thought belonged to them. That's it. So they're going to have the Ukraine that they always deserved instead of the Ukraine that they always wanted. Um, but for them, that's still living under Russian rule. Um, and there's no way that the Ukrainians are making these decisions in isolation. I think every major attack on a city center, on civilian centers that the Ukrainians have been doing, on the nuclear power plant, on the hydraulic power plant in Novokhovna. I think all of these attacks have to be approved by the Americans first. And so, if something catastrophic doesn't even happen between, so in other words, they're willing to do another Chernobyl just to freeze the conflict. That's what I'm worried about.
Oh, yes. And it also does have that strange effect where they're trying to rehabilitate the image of nuclear energy in the West right now in light of Germany's frankly foolish decision, which is on top of Ukraine arguably trying to, or at least elements within Ukraine arguably trying to cause a fallout. So there's a bit of an interesting contrast there. And at this rate, I I do fear that this could be a massive escalation, that there is room for a false flag here, but I won't speculate on that too much for the time being. And I just do have one last piece of European news to contrast us from the UK and Germany. That is news coming out of Hungary, where the foreign minister Szijjártó, I believe I'm pronouncing my Hungarian names right, said that Gazprom is supplying gas in excess following the contracts. So it seems that Hungary and Serbia are the only nations in Europe that are going to be able to keep their lights on. And perhaps, like I said, Serbia, Hungary may find themselves as some of these third party nations, like India has been trying to be, like we saw with Egypt. And at that point, unless the Europeans are going to blink first and come to serious negotiations with Russia regarding energy, and of course that would need the blessing of Washington, which I don't even know what it would take to get that, or or it'd be an act of complete defiance that would create a rift large in the Atlantic. So, I mean, it's one of the two if the Europeans are ever going to come to any serious agreement with the Russians, particularly on the issue of sanctions and energy. Which, if things get as bad as Putin may have insinuated, some of these regime changes, I suppose you call it, may be willing to come to the table. I suppose only time will tell with that. But the situation in Europe is frankly dire. I mean, you hear a lot about the African and Middle East uh, and how the halting of grain shipments and shipments out of Russia is going to affect them. And, that's certainly important to talk about. There's a potential famine in one of the most densely populated parts of the world, and one of the most populous continents in the world. Certainly worth some attention. But I think we're also overlooking the collapse of several European nations into second world and sub second world status if these continue, if these sanctions and these economic crises continue for a prolonged period of time.
Right. And I think now you can kind of see, last week we were talking about, the American long-term strategy, which is to get as many Ukrainian boys killed so that you have families that have generational animosity towards Russia and Russians to just to essentially perpetuate that. Now, it's not a big effort for recruits or conscriptions that are coming out of the West. They already feel that way. In fact, many of them don't want to go to Donbass because they don't feel that's their territory, but they want someone else to die for it. However, they are still being forced to go out there. However, there are conscriptions from central Ukraine, which, generally they might be neither here nor there in terms of choosing sides. Well, now they'll be forced to. But there is also, I think, now what's becoming clear, Russia's long range plan with the war, um, and the sanctions and the kind of economic and energy turmoil that Europe finds itself in. And that is, I think it's to Russia's advantage to win this war slowly and incrementally. The reason for it is, let's suppose they attacked, because some units did originate from Belarus in order to attack or contain Kiev. But there is a highway that stretches north-south in western Ukraine. Now, if they wanted, like, they would have needed a substantially bigger force to do this. But they could have stopgapped the amount of arms flowing into Ukraine from Poland if they had done this, right? How they would have contained it, I don't know. But the theory is it might have ended the war sooner. Russia still will take out shipments. There was a recent shipment that was knocked out on a train from Nikolaev to the Donbass front. But my guess is, because remember, there's still areas that Russia's still supplying gas, internet, like they haven't cut those things off. In the war-torn areas, of course, that's a different story. However, if Russia had gone for an early win with a bigger force, and more devastation, it would likely have consolidated uh, European unity under American command rather quickly. The longer the war drags on, the less likely that Europe will want to fight. The more problems that it has for lack of energy, right? The more divided they will become. And so that is Russia's strategy for this war, in my opinion.
Oh, absolutely. It has the added benefits of not only accomplishing the goals that they've had in Ukraine for several years now, but it takes care of the massive looming problem of a Europe solidly under the control of the American Empire. And I guess the only way to wrangle that control is to delegitimize the American Empire, which is really just doing what they're doing. It is delegitimization enough, and
Yeah.
it's. I mean, it all has to come to a head eventually. There's no solution, magic solution for this, unless Russia comes to the table. Like I said, despite even all the supposed military setbacks and even the real military setbacks that Russia has faced in Ukraine, or even if it walks away with maybe not as much territory as you would have expected. The fundamental shift they've caused in Europe is a massive victory in and of itself, possibly on par, if not greater than Ukraine. Because at this point, although you have these countries going on with sanctions, what do you think the confidence level of the American empire is among your average European, whether that be from France, Germany, Spain, wherever?
Right. It's not that high. In fact, Estonia has now proposed that uh, Europe stop all visas for any Russians coming into the Schengen zone of the EU. And the reason they're doing this is Russians are not bothered. Uh, there is no lash back against Putin. Roughly 80% think that he's doing the right thing and he's doing it well.
And that's according
Uh,
to Polish sources.
yeah, that's according to Polish sources. So those aren't even Russian sources, right? Um, uh, and this is what's causing desperation. And you have, again, Estonia saying, Uh, we have to work with Finland to create to turn the Baltic Sea into a NATO lake and not allow any more Russian ships to the rhetoric has gone through the roof. It's because it's not happening. Again, the closer they get to an economic and energy catastrophe, right? Russia is very happy, I think, to turn off all the pipes. They're going to just continue to play this game. And all these countries that refuse to pay, they're all paying now in rubles, um, or they're not going to get it. There's a whole other world where Russian oil and gas can go, and the pipeline from Norway going into Poland. Well, that's only about half complete, so that I don't think is going to go online probably for another 4 or 5 months minimum. I could be wrong, but from what I've read, that's what I see happening. And this is where I think the desperation is going to come in. On the one hand, the Americans cannot afford a defeat in Ukraine. On the other hand, they can't afford for Europe to go towards this direction. Yes, it keeps America on top of Europe. Yes, it does do that. But uh, it cannot allow itself to do that if Russia remains strong. That's the takeaway. Russia and Europe have to go down several pegs for America to be happy with Europe becoming poorer. It can't just happen to Europe, right? That is, I think, the most worrisome part of this situation.
Oh, I mean, they will do a complete race to the bottom, and like you said, they will drive Europe to the bottom of the Atlantic if it means getting one over on Russia. But the problem is they're not getting one over on Russia, so they're just going to keep driving further until
Yeah.
they at least they hope they do. In which case, I'm left wondering when that will happen. But that's all I had for today. If you have anything else, any last minute thing.
Uh, no, not really.
Because today's episode was, let's just say, a bit hefty, we may come back during sometime in the middle of the week and cover some of the stuff that we didn't get to. There were a couple things, particularly the Afghanistan thing, I want to do a retrospective on. So keep your eye out for that. But otherwise, thank you for tuning into the War Report. We will see you guys next time, and goodbye.
And actually, yes, goodbye and take care. But before there is something, our friend Geo, uh, I think people in our circle know who Geo is. He is going to be coming onto the show, and it could happen this week or this coming week or next weekend. So we'll let you know. I guess you'll let them know on Twitter. I'm locked
Oh,
out of
certainly.
Twitter. I can see all the fabulous tweets, but I can't like or share. I can't DM or anything like that. But yeah, so that's some great news. Uh, yeah, we'll tell you more
Yeah, so keep your eye out for that.
later.
I'll make some posts on YouTube just to let you guys know the situation. And yeah, that is coming down the pipe. So we will see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Goodbye and take care.